After several sustained days of protests in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd on May 25th, the epicenter of this latest uprising movement, Minneapolis, is experiencing an over-militarized response, with Minnesota National Guard troops joining alongside Minneapolis Police Department and the Minnesota State Police law enforcement agencies in attempting to quell the uprisings. But organizers on the ground there are using their ingenuity to coordinate mutual aid and redistribution efforts, plus providing a platform for the solution to the crisis of over-policing and brutality: get rid of the police altogether.
I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but I look around and I see what's being done to my kind. Every day I'm being hard to this parade. My people don't want no trouble. We finna no struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
The night that Dr. King was on, we spoke about death. I asked him the question, did he fear for his life? And he said, not really. He had overcome his fear of death, and now he was focused on not how long he would live, but what would be the quality of the time that he would live. Where he said, this is no longer about race, it's now about the welfare and the well-being of human life. We must talk about economics, we must talk about where people are poor. We must galvanize our nation to begin to take care of the poor. America should not have no poor people. No one should ever go to bed hungry. There should be gainful employment. There should be a living wage. There should be access to health with no charge. We should have education for free, like so many other nations successfully have applied. All these things put a huge bullseye on Dr. King because he was now tampering with the playground of the wealthy. And when he came to that moment about dismantling the economic construct, he had to go.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
In 1968, Martin Luther King was killed. Robert Kennedy was killed. Medgar Evers was killed. Mark Clark and Fred Hampton were killed. John Carlos and Tommy Smith did the Black Power salute in Mexico City. I mean, it is a litany of things that took place in 68. Like, that was the moving the stone from in front of the cave in 68. I mean, it really was a special beginning and opening. And unfortunately, anytime you have anything that's an opening, death accompanies those things.
When white America killed Dr. King last night, she declared war on us.
There were many sacrifices. When they say we stand on the shoulders of people, we are actually in the palm of the hands of a lot of folks, because we were moved and motivated and charged up by people who had already made a commitment in the 60s to bring about change. And even though I was really on the periphery, I was on the outside looking in, I didn't know much. I knew I wanted to be a part of the Black Power movement, but I didn't know how to be a part of it. But I felt it was something necessary. No, what he he did. I still could not have marched with Dr. King. I could never have been with him on any level. I did not agree with his philosophy, and I still don't agree with his philosophy.
They called in the combined police forces of Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco, the California Highway Patrol, and 3,000 National Guardsmen. And they just went crazy. They began shooting at everything they moved. They shot about 300 people, but they only killed one person.
I do agree with fighting fire with fire. I'm not going to fight fire with water necessarily. I mean, if someone charges at me, I'm going to defend myself. Dr. King was not about that, but what he did do, the exposing the demons that existed in America, that's priceless. You can't, I mean, it was a sacrifice, but he showed you, this is America. Look at this. I mean, we're nonviolent. We're singing We Shall Overcome. And they got the dogs on us. They're putting us in prison. They're beating the hell out of us. And of course, when he was killed, I was shattered just by the fact that this man wasn't fighting with the guns and weapons that they're fighting with. So I personally felt an insult to that, but I could have never marched Malcolm's concepts and theories about how we should deal with ourselves, how we should really function in this society. That's what made sense to me. So when you look at the last poets, you're really looking at disciples of Malcolm X.
That as long as a white man does it, it's all right. A black man is supposed to have no feelings. But when a black man strikes back, he's an extremist. He's supposed to sit passively and have no feelings, be nonviolent, and love his enemy. No matter what kind of attack, be it verbal or otherwise, he's supposed to take it. But if he stands up and in any way tries to defend himself, then he's an extremist.
Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for black people in the United States. His major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart. That's very good. He only made one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none.
A few words about Martin Luther King's nonviolence movement.
I think Dr. King is a great man, full of compassion. He is full of mercy, and he's very patient. He is a man who could accept the uncivilized behavior of white Americans, their unceasing taunts, and still have in his heart forgiveness. Unfortunately, I am from a younger generation. I am not as patient as Dr. King, nor am I as merciful as Dr. King. And their unwillingness to deal with someone like Dr. King just means they have to deal with this young generation.
This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now. Look what I'm whipping now. This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now. Look what I'm whipping now.
Tired of being peaceful and tired of being calm, you know. They've been going to war on us for over 400 years, so hey, I ain't peaceful. I ain't no protest. I'm violent.
Talking to him. Tell him how you feel. Tell him what kind of hell you've been catching, and let him know that if he's not ready to clean his house up, he shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down.
video shows protesters earlier jumping on the cruiser. The decision was made to remove a portion of the windshield so the officer could remove the vehicle.
We suffer political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation, all of them from the same enemy. The government has failed us. You can't deny that. Anytime you live in the 20th century, 1964, and you walking around here singing, "We shall overcome," the government has failed us. This is part of what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. Today it's time to stop singing and start swinging. You can't sing up on freedom, but you can swing up on some freedom. Cassius Clay can sing, but singing didn't help him to become the heavyweight champion of the world. Swinging helped him. So this government has failed us. The government itself has failed us. And the white liberals who have been posing as our friends have failed us. And once we see that all these other sources to which we've turned have failed, we stop turning to them and turn to ourselves. We need a self-help program, a do-it-yourself philosophy, a do-it-right-now philosophy. It's already too late philosophy. This is what you and I need to get with. And the only way we're going to solve our problem is with a self-help program. We must understand the politics of our community. And we must know what politics is supposed to produce. We must know what part politics play in our lives. And until we become politically mature, we will always be misled, led astray, or deceived or maneuvered into supporting someone politically who doesn't have the good of our community at heart.
I'm no politician. I'm not even a student of politics. I'm not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American, and got sense enough to know it. I'm one of the 22 million black victims of the Democrats. One of the 22 million black victims of the Republicans, and one of the 22 million black victims of Americanism. And when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat or a Republican. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. You and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. When we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see America through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of Americanism. We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare. We haven't benefited from America's democracy. We've only suffered from America's hypocrisy. And the generation that's coming up now can see it and are not afraid to say it.
Let's take the movement a step further.
I believe that a time has come, a point has been reached where a line just has to be drawn. There's a favorite line that I know about, and it says that there is a point where caution ends and cowardice begins. All three of these pigs that we have a choice of, Oink Nixon, Oink Humphrey, and Oink Wallace, they're not for us. They do not represent They do not represent the best interests of this country. They definitely don't represent the best thinking in this country. In fact, they represent the very worst tradition that was ever to crawl from beneath the rocks in this bankrupt country.
No, we're making the revolution by educating the people to the fact that they should arm themselves for self-defense. You see, educate them to what the power structure is doing to them, that they've made racism the primary objective that the people have to deal with when we mainly have to deal with capitalism. You see? The more we intensify the struggle, you're going to see more and more where they're going to start killing us because they got too many of us in jail now. And they don't want no more of us in jail, so they got to kill us. So it's not fun having all these people in jail. But these are freedom fighters. They're the vanguards. And they're here to liberate the people, and they know this. They either have to go to jail or die. And if you're not prepared for that, then you don't belong to the Black Panther Party.
Black Panther Party started in Oakland, California, and so, you know, the party is known mostly for its confrontational stances, and that's a good thing, to be confrontational against evil and violence. The kind of problems that the Black community suffer, unequal levels of imprisonment, unequal levels of access to resources, poor health. And so the Black Panther Party tried to model for the community some of the possible solutions that were not capitalist oriented, like free clinic. You know, you can come here and get free medical care, or send your children to us, we will feed them for free. And this idea of free breakfast is one of the legacies that's been adopted. Now the schools have free breakfast, but they didn't before. I think the party, that's not the only organization that did it, but it's the only organization based in ghetto communities that did it.
Underlying the prison industrial complex, there's been a consistency. And the consistency has been to target vulnerable people. And the definition of vulnerable has some variation over time and space. And we can see greater intensities in certain times and places and lesser in others. So, for example, modestly educated people in the prime of life who are not white have been targeted significantly, but so have white people, especially but not exclusively in rural America. People not documented to work have been targeted, but so have people who have been documented not to work, which is to say people who have been carrying convictions regardless of their citizenship status. But what's also key to my understanding of what's going on now is the fact that police departments, or what they like to call themselves, police organizations, over time have gotten greater and greater power to participate in many aspects of social life that other state agencies used to take care of. In other words, police organizations, especially in big cities, here in New York City, in the city of Los Angeles, and we could probably name many, many others, have internalized the mission of social welfare organizations. And the difference between what they do and what these other state agencies have done is that they demand a certain kind of self-policing or unbadged deputy status in order for people to qualify for meager social goods and benefits. At the same time, agencies whose mission has never been about policing and punishment, let's say the United States Department of Education, or any number of welfare and other agencies, health, for example, have internalized the mission of policing in order to allocate the scarce resources that they have between the so-called deserving and the undeserving. So one case in point that I like to use as an example is the United States Department of Education has a SWAT team. Why would they have a SWAT team? To legitimize what they do in the eyes of the completely delegitimized and yet still large set of agencies whose work is supposed to be social welfare, social goods, social benefits, and, dare I say, social justice.
A year ago, the Black Panthers were much more active. You heard much more about that type of struggle. Is the time of the Black Panthers past?
The Black Panthers still exist, and the Black Panthers are still extremely active in the Oakland community and in communities all over the country. I'm not sure whether you are aware of what is now happening in the Black Panther Party and the kinds of things that members of that party are doing now.
No, but tell me.
First of all, if you're going to talk about a revolutionary situation, you have to have people who are physically able to wage revolution, who are physically able to organize and physically able to do all that is done.
Yeah, but the question is more, how do you get there? Do you get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, is that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a black person and live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman and I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a, quote, militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa. The topic of this event is very timely and very appropriate: oppression and repression in the United States. The major problem we are confronting today, the major problem people throughout this country are confronting, is the problem of racism. And I think that if the last 4 years or any indication of what is to come during the next 4 years, we can indeed predict a very catastrophic period within the history of this country. Black and brown and Asian and Native American people have always been the first victims of oppression and repression in this country. But I think that white people in this country, particularly white working people, should begin to understand that they too are exploited and they too can be victims of repression. On many occasions in the past, and especially during this recent period after the elections, I have used the word fascism. I have talked about an increasingly fascist danger which people in this country must begin to come to grips with. Some people have accused me of using rhetoric which doesn't have any basis in reality. But I think that we have to be very serious during these very critical moments. We have to understand that there is indeed a very real danger, menace of fascism in the United States today. I do not think that we have already entered into a period of full-blown fascism, because fascism is not something that suddenly explodes and erupts into being. If we look back into the history of the world, if we look at countries like Germany, Spain, Italy, we see that fascism is a process. It's something that grows and develops. It's like a cancer. It starts attacking one group of people, but like a cancer, it begins to spread out with a fatal rapidity, and eventually, like a cancer, it destroys everything around it.
The state apparatus, as it operates in America, has been used almost since Columbus showed up on these shores to be a repressive power. This is how we had the genocide of the indigenous people here. The acts of brutality and genocide that was exercised against them was sanctioned by the state, and there was no, there's no punishment for the people who were brutalizing and murdering people of the native people in this country. The enslavement of people of African descent in this country was legalized. That was a state apparatus that functioned for hundreds of years. So the state has always used its criminalization process to control and destroy acts of dissent. If we look at the fugitive slave laws, if we look at the way slave rebellions were put down, there were over 750 slave rebellions in the United States, and the use of state force to come down and murder, lynch, and terrorize people of African descent for simply trying to gain their freedom was the norm in this country for many years. And as we've evolved over time, the methods have changed, but the intent has not. So if you look at civil rights activists, for instance, or people who even preceded that, if you look at Marcus Garvey, was incarcerated by the state when they couldn't get him on anything else. They went after him for tax violations. You look at Fannie Lou Hamer was beaten and jailed. Kwame Ture, then known as Stokely Carmichael, was incarcerated. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was incarcerated. The practice of using criminalization and incarceration against movements is, as American as apple pie. During the 60s, you had the involvement of a program called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program by the FBI, and it was used first to go after leftist groups, specifically the Communist Party, but as J. Edgar Hoover became more and more incensed with the civil rights movement, he used it to go after Dr. Martin Luther King, various other black leaders, and focused with great intensity on the Black Panther Party, engaging in all manner of acts of illegality. And that illegality was eventually the subject of a congressional hearing led by Senator Frank Church, who was out of Utah, I believe, at the time, and found that virtually every act that was committed under COINTELPRO was illegal and unconstitutional. So what we've seen is an evolution of state repression through using the criminal and justice system, and nothing has changed.
I think the Black Power movement, I always think of it as three different movements, three different legacies. The most evident is this idea of building Black institutions, buying Black, supporting Black business, but not necessarily transforming or revolutionizing society. Nowadays, it's manifest in slogans like the color of Black power is green. It's about making money and supporting our businesses. It's not a revolutionary ideology. Another extreme, and that is a kind of cultural nationalism. And it goes in ebbs and flows. When Spike Lee's film Malcolm X came out, it was the height of a kind of cultural nationalist sort of resurrection. And then finally, the other element is the Black radical tradition. It's a tradition of struggle, of organization. And how does it exist today? It certainly exists in certain forms of hip hop. You can actually chart both the organizational forms and rhetoric of Black power in second wave feminism, in the gay liberation movement, where the gay liberation movement post-Stonewall in New York, but also in San Francisco, in many ways adopted the language of Black power, gay power, feminist power.
If you look at the world, my dear brother, you could wake up, you could say, I don't want to get up out of bed, because, the rich are getting richer, not only in America, but in the world. The young people have got to see it. Sometimes a lot of the young people who are in their 40s now say, I'm tired. I said, you can't be tired. Take a rest, take a vacation. But this is a lifetime job. We've got to talk about that 1% or 5% that runs everything, It's a lot of work. You don't get any reward, so you really don't get a reward, But the point is that the reward is knowing that when you make transition, when you die, if you have children, there's a better world for them. And if you don't have children, there's a better world for other people too.
If we take seriously the fact that to engage in critical political practices in whatever moment we inhabit is to embrace the humility of what it means to be part of a historical legacy, right? Then I think it helps us take even more seriously and urgently the fact that it is not only a logical consequence to be an abolitionist, but it's an ethical and historical obligation to be an abolitionist. That if there is such a thing as standing on the shoulders of history and ancestors and guiding one's own political and biological descendants, that abolition becomes a necessary ethical obligation. And to not engage in some attempt at that practice is actually unethical, right? That if you are to be judged by history, then it's to say that you have to embrace that obligation, that ethical obligation. So in the current moment, I think we can see that what is unfolding is the fact that to engage and embrace in what we call in abolitionist politics, it means at bare minimum two things. One is extraordinarily vigorous debate and argument over who and what inhabit an abolitionist position, right? Meaning it's a question of whether there's such a thing as people who are more inclined to be able to inhabit abolitionism, and on the other hand, what the politics of abolition, right, what the thought and practices of abolition actually look like in this day and time. There's of course a language around people who are most vulnerable should be the ones to guide and lead an abolitionist position. The reason why we should have healthy suspicion of that is that it presumes a definitive sense of vulnerability, right? If we understand that there are logics of vulnerability that focus on particular people, categories of people all the time, black people, right? Colonized people, people considered to be gender non-normative, right? We can understand those lines of vulnerability all the time, but within those lines of vulnerability, there's complexity as well, right? So this is the other side of the argument. This is to push back against the argument as well as of those who would say we're all vulnerable, because we know we're not, right? I'd love to have white people problems all the time, right? I struggle to have white people problems. That means I have all kinds of good stuff going on. I don't have to worry about rent and food. So if we have a complex understanding of what it means to be vulnerable and what it means to be doing work alongside and in identification and intimacy with positions of vulnerability, including long historical structured vulnerability to these systems, that to me is the starting point for abolitionist practice. In the immediate sense of what does an abolitionist practice look like right now, I think what I'm going to continue to argue for the near future, most likely, is that it's in large part a challenge of political culture and political pedagogy. Meaning that this is about language, it's about how we think and how we teach, it's about taking the cultural dimension seriously and understanding that the counter warfare against domestic war, against racist and gender domestic war, against proto-genocidal domestic war is in significant part a cultural problem. And the reason I say that is this. I've seen so many rooms of people who bombard audiences. I mean, I'm talking audiences K through 12 students to elders. Bombard audiences with all kinds of statistics and empirical evidence that demonstrates that the only real position that one can inhabit right now is at the bare minimum a complete overhaul of the way policing and incarceration and so-called criminal justice work, right? And this is folks who will show evidence about so-called disparities and asymmetries across lines of race, gender, class, and all the rest of it. It is very often not in the least convincing, right? Especially for folks in the room who believe that there need to be prisons and policing, that there need to be people, lots of people locked up, lots of black people locked up, lots of brown people locked up, that there need to be tons of cops on the street doing their dirt, even with the periodic scandals of violence against their cousin and their uncle who got killed. Even with that, the statistics, the empirical evidence don't necessarily convince people of anything, right? Which means that there's a whole dimension that we need to articulate, which is the cultural dimension. We need to have stories to tell, ways to retell a historical story, another way to narrate what is true and what is not true, and ultimately, it's about a way to tell a story of humanity, of living as human beings that draws from the very existence of those who are deemed to be other than human, right? Meaning those who are designated under the structures of gendered racist criminalization as being other than human. That's the position. That's the position that actually demonstrates the possibility for something other than the current condition of mankind that we're kind of coerced to live under.
We the people are the ones who gonna have to fight. We used to say, which side are you on? Which side are you on?
To those seeking freedom. To
those committed to abolishing slavery, to those who want liberation for all, we announce the formation of the revolutionary abolitionist movement. The United States was built on slavery, and despite the American Civil War, this oppression never ended. The abolitionist movement fought against this tyranny, but modern slavery and mass brutality persist unchecked. Fascism is on the rise. The state has openly declared war on our communities, threatened to ethnically cleanse Latinos, criminalize Muslims, destroy indigenous land, and oppress the LGBTQ community, while continuing to murder and incarcerate black people. The revolutionary abolitionist movement unequivocally states that the plantation system must be destroyed.
See, before I draw the line, let me welcome you close to all the folks who knew Obama sold the people a hoax. Gave the money to suckers while our community's still poor. Withdrew the troops but started another war. Colonizing, terrorizing, creating the oil crisis so they can make a killing on food and gas prices. Prisons is filling, they trying to lock up the future. Militarized borders and control of computers. Want a stupid bumping music that ain't healthy for the shortest. Privatizing schools and policemen in the hallways. Can't be dormant, I'm awoken. Rise up, be ready. Brought the family with us, and we hold the machetes.
Riding the fence, riding the fence. Too many people be riding the fence. Yeah, you say you ready for war, but are you convinced? I'm not convinced. If you're a rider, freedom fighter, crowd excited, then let's do this. We can make one big united, middle finger to the U.S. Give me the bravest and the truest. Fuck the hippest and the coolest. We gon' spark this revolution and cross this off our to-do list. Put your foot down if you look down on this criminal system. Put your book down and get shook down like my niggas in prison. Don't be condemning and condoning their actions in one sentence. Make up your mind, choose your side. Is you a patriot or a menace to society? So riot or sit by quietly. But don't pull out your flag and try to say you gon' ride with me. You flip-flopping like hip-hop. I don't get locked in that trick box. Get got like Big and Pop. Shit's got to stop. I am the people, not the pig. I repeat after Fred. So please blow my brains out if I ever forget.
I'm with the independent thinkers. I'm down with the movers and the shakers and the ex-Henny drinkers, the non-smokers, the health advocates, the non-voters, the young bloods in the hood training like soldiers. I'm on the side of the tracks with the hood guardians, the little child that don't color inside the margins. I don't ride the fence, I cultivate my strength, cause if it ain't about power, it don't make sense. I've been down with Boogie Down since BDP and Brown Pride, and Black Power make RBG. A OG told me choose battles wisely. In the struggle, don't forget your children and your wifey. If you don't see me on the podium preaching it, every day I hope my every action is teaching it. Cause revolution is a process, it's not a speech or a panel. Don't bite off more than you can handle.
Rock hard like slingshots in Palestina. Con todos los estudiantes por educación gratuita. I'm with workers uprising and the right to unionize. We ain't crossed the border, so you better legalize. I'm with La Peña del Bronx. I'm still with Victor Toro, cause gentrification is polluting my borough. So bro, never. South Bronx forever. Decolonize the block, make your neighborhood better. I ain't down with the rich, I'm more Richie Perez. Don't talk to grand juries or cooperate with feds. I'm with students, doctors, janitors, teachers. We need living wages, but they don't believe us. Monida, Barretto, Spofford, Hunts Point, my hood, I love. We join forces, forming our DEC, taking over buildings, rebel Diaz for the children.
Politics to sickness, streets express symptoms, caught up with a quickness. Big business pimps them, scholars play the simpleton, fools play with wisdom. Who will stand and fight back? Who will play the victim? Trials and tribulations, injured generations, stolen history and outsourced innovation. Babel Tower fell, tribes are at war. The battle story's not represented in the score. The game's fixed, most of the faces and names switched. Credit stolen for art, science, religion, Haitian language, technology, philosophy, and what strange is. They paid in hatred for the knowledge of the ancients. Power in words, actions, guns, swords. Aim Panthers, brown berets, young lords. Pick a side, one sickness, one cure, one love, one blood, one world, but one war.